Koya, Shintizi, Naki.
When you hear the word Apache, what comes to mind? Be honest. Warrior, savage, Geronimo, the last holdout, the wild one who finally surrendered, maybe a helicopter. The AH-64 Apache, the US Army named one of its most lethal weapons after them, which is either a tribute or an irony so thick you could choke on it depending on how you look at it. The Apache have been in American popular cool chair for over a century, in films, in novels, in history textbooks, in the names of military hardware. They are one of the most recognizable indigenous peoples in American history, and almost everything most people think they know about them is either incomplete, distorted, or built on a version of events told entirely by the people who were trying to destroy them. That last part is not an exaggeration. The historical record on the Apache, the documents, the military reports, the newspaper accounts, the policy papers, was almost entirely produced by the United States Army, the territorial government of Arizona, land speculators, and journalists who had never met an Apache person and had financial or political reasons to justify what was being done to them. This is not ancient history either. The last Apache prisoners of war, men, women, and children held by the United States government, were not released until 1913. 1913, the year before World War I began, within living memory of people your grandparents might have known. So let's talk about what actually happened and why the version most people learned is missing most of the story. Who the Apache actually were. Start here because the foundation matters. The Apache were not one tribe. They were a collection of related but distinct peoples: the Chiricahua, the Mescalero, the Jicarilla, the Western Apache, the Lipan, the Kiowa Apache, sharing linguistic roots and certain cultural practices, but governing themselves independently, with their own leaders, their own territories, their own political relationships with neighboring peoples. They had lived in the region covering modern-day Arizona, New Mexico, western Texas, and northern Mexico for centuries before any European arrived. Their relationship with that landscape was not incidental, it was fundamental. The desert and mountain terrain of the Southwest, which American military commanders repeatedly described as inhospitable, brutal, nearly impassable, was home territory to the Apache in the deepest sense of that word. They knew water sources that did not appear on any map. They knew passes through mountain ranges that seemed impenetrable from the outside. They could move across distances in days that took US Army columns weeks. This was not mysticism, it was knowledge, accumulated over generations, passed down with the same intentionality that European cultures passed down written texts. And honestly, understanding this changes the entire framing of what the US Army called the Apache Wars, because you cannot understand why the Apache fought the way they fought without understanding that they were fighting for land they had inhabited for centuries, against an invasion that arrived with the explicit goal of removing them from it permanently. The Spanish first, the longer history. The United States was not the first colonial power the Apache dealt with. The Spanish arrived in the Southwest in the 16th century. The early relationship was complicated, not simply hostile from the beginning. There were periods of trade, of negotiated coexistence, of Apache groups serving as scouts and auxiliaries for Spanish military operations against other indigenous peoples. But Spanish colonial policy carried structural violence inside it regardless of individual relationships. Slave raiding, Apache people, particularly children, were captured and sold into forced labor in Spanish colonial settlements. This happened for generations. It was documented. It was legal under Spanish colonial law. The Apache response to slave raiding was raiding back, which the Spanish recorded as Apache aggression. The cycle of violence that characterized Apache colonial relations for 2 centuries was not initiated by the Apache. It was initiated by a colonial system that treated indigenous people as a labor resource to be extracted. This context, 200 years of it, is almost entirely absent from the American history of the Apache Wars that begins in the 1860s. It matters because the Apache who encountered American expansion in the mid-19th century were not encountering colonialism for the first time. They had watched it operate for 200 years. They had extremely well-founded reasons for the conclusions they drew about what American expansion meant for them. The Americans arrive and break the first agreement. When the United States took control of the Southwest following the Mexican-American War in 1848, the situation shifted again. Initial Apache-American relations were not uniformly hostile. Cochise, leader of the Chiricahua Apache, one of the most significant Apache leaders of the 19th century, maintained peaceful relations with American settlers and the U.S. military through the 1850s. He allowed American mail routes to operate through Apache territory. He maintained agreements. He operated in good faith within a framework of negotiated coexistence. And then came the Bascom Affair, 1861. A young U.S. Army lieutenant named George Bascom summoned Cochise to a meeting at Apache Pass under a flag of truce. Cochise came, with family members. Bascom accused him of raiding a ranch and kidnapping a child. Cochise denied it. Truthfully, the raid had been conducted by a different Apache group, the Western Apache, not his Chiricahua. He offered to help recover the child. Bascom attempted to arrest him. Cochise escaped, cutting through the side of the tent. His family members were held hostage. What followed was a rapid escalation. Both sides took hostages. Violence broke out. Hostages on both sides were killed. Cochise went to war. He remained at war with the United States for the next 11 years. Think about that sequence carefully. A leader who had maintained peaceful relations for years, who came to a meeting under a flag of truce, who was truthful about his lack of involvement in the incident, who offered cooperation, was subjected to an attempted arrest based on a false accusation. And the war that followed, years of violence, hundreds of deaths on both sides, enormous suffering, is traced in American military history as Apache aggression. The Bascom Affair gets a footnote. The Apache Wars, the series of armed conflicts between various Apache groups and the United States military between roughly 1849 and 1886, are typically framed in American historical memory as a pacification campaign, the bringing of order to a frontier, the necessary if regrettable process of civilization expanding westward. This framing requires ignoring quite a lot. The explicit goal of US policy in Arizona Territory was not coexistence, it was removal. Apache people were to be confined to reservations, areas of land designated by the federal government, often selected specifically because they were least valuable for American settlement and mining interests. The Apache were to be removed from their actual homeland and placed somewhere else, dependent on government food rations, forbidden from leaving. When Apache groups resisted this, when they left reservations to return to their own land, or to escape starvation when government rations were inadequate or simply not delivered, the US military was sent to force them back, or to kill them. General Philip Sheridan, who commanded US forces during significant portions of the Apache conflict, is on record with positions about indigenous people that require no interpretive generosity to understand as genocidal in intent. His actual documented views on the subject were not ambiguous, and the operations conducted under his command reflected those views. The Camp Grant Massacre of 1871 is one of the most documented and least discussed events of this period. A group of Aravaipa Apache, around 500 people, had surrendered to US Army Lieutenant Royal Whitman at Camp Grant in Arizona Territory. They were living peacefully near the camp under US Army protection. Whitman described them in his reports as genuinely committed to peace. On April 30, 1871, a group of around 150 Tucson civilians, Anglo-Americans, Mexican-Americans, and Tohono O'odham attacked the Apache camp before dawn. Most of the Apache men were away. The people in the camp were primarily women, children, and elderly. Approximately 144 Apache people were killed, most of them women and children. Around 29 children were taken and sold into slavery in Mexico. The Tucson attackers returned home and were celebrated in the local press. A federal trial was eventually held. The 108 men indicted were acquitted by a Tucson jury after 19 minutes of deliberation. 19 minutes. Lieutenant Whitman, who had tried to protect the Apache under his care and was devastated by what happened, was court-martialed, not for failing to prevent the massacre, but as a result of political pressure from the Tucson faction that had organized it. This is not a disputed account. It is documented in federal records, military correspondence, and contemporary newspaper reporting. It is simply not in most history textbooks. Geronimo is the Apache name most Americans know. The legend is a warrior, a holdout, the last one to surrender, the wild one who kept the US Army chasing him for years. The legend is not false exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. Geronimo's Apache name was Goya Awe. It means one who yawns. The name Geronimo, a Spanish version of the name Jerome, was reportedly given to him by Mexican soldiers, possibly as a battle cry invoking Saint Jerome during engagements against him. He was born around 1829 in what is now New Mexico. In 1851, Mexican soldiers attacked his camp while the men were away trading in a nearby town. His mother, his wife, and his 3 children were killed. He returned to find them dead. This is not background. This is the beginning of everything that follows. He became a raider against Mexico, repeatedly, ferociously, over decades. When American expansion brought a new colonial power into the equation, his assessment of American intentions, based on what he had witnessed of how colonial powers operated, was not optimistic. He was right. The Chiricahua Apache were removed from their reservation at Apache Pass, land that had been guaranteed to them by treaty, when the federal government decided the land was needed for other purposes. Geronimo broke out from the San Carlos Reservation multiple times. San Carlos was not simply a place the Apache didn't want to be for sentimental reasons. It was, by multiple contemporary accounts, including American military officers stationed there, a place of genuine deprivation, inadequate rations, disease, confinement to land entirely unsuitable for the Apache's traditional subsistence practices. General George Crook, who fought against the Apache and is generally considered one of the more honest American officers of the period, described conditions at San Carlos in terms that contradict the official narrative of generous government provision. Geronimo's breakouts were not irrational violence. They were responses to confinement, starvation, and the repeated violation of agreements made with his people. He finally surrendered in September 1886. He was the last. The conventional history of the Apache Wars ends with Geronimo's surrender in 1886. The story closes. The frontier is won. Order is established. What happened after 1886 is almost entirely absent from the standard narrative. And what happened after 1886 is arguably the most disturbing part of the entire story. Geronimo and approximately 500 Chiricahua Apache, including people who had never left the reservation, including Apache scouts who had served the US Army loyally and helped track Geronimo down, were loaded onto trains and transported to Florida, to Fort Marion and Fort Pickens in Florida, not to a reservation in the Southwest, not to land anywhere near their home territory, to Florida, 2,000 miles away, in a humid subtropical climate entirely unlike the desert mountains they had lived in for generations. They had not been told where they were going. They arrived in a place they had never seen, with a climate their bodies were not adapted to, without adequate shelter, without adequate food, without medical care appropriate to the diseases that flourished in that environment. Tuberculosis moved through the community. Children died. The Apache scouts who had helped the US Army, men who had been explicitly promised by General Crook that their cooperation would be rewarded with fair treatment, were imprisoned alongside the people they had helped capture. General Crook was reportedly furious. He considered it a profound breach of faith and said so publicly. He was ignored. The Chiricahua spent years in Florida, then were moved to Alabama, then to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. They were classified as prisoners of war for 27 years. Their children were taken and sent to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, the boarding school system whose explicit stated purpose, in the words of its founder Richard Henry Pratt, was to kill the Indian and save the man. Children separated from families, forbidden from speaking Apache, forbidden from practicing Apache cultural traditions, punished for using their own language. This was federal policy, funded by Congress, operating in the open. The last Chiricahua prisoners of war were not released until 1913. Some of the children sent to Carlisle never came home. They died there, of disease, of despair, of the particular damage done to a child separated from everything they know and forbidden from being who they are. They are buried in a cemetery at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, far from home. Geronimo spent his last years at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, still technically a prisoner of war. He became, in a profound and uncomfortable irony, a celebrity. He appeared at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. He rode in Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in 1905. He sold photographs of himself and handmade bows and arrows to tourists. He requested, repeatedly, to be allowed to return to Arizona. The request was denied, every time. The official reason given was that Arizona settlers would not be safe if the Apache returned. The real reason was that the land the Chiricahua had occupied, their actual homeland, had been taken. Settlement and mining interests had moved in. The Apache could not return because their return would raise questions about the legitimacy of what had been done to them. Geronimo died at Fort Sill in February 1909 of pneumonia, contracted after falling from his horse in cold weather and lying in the cold before being found. He was approximately 80 years old. He died a prisoner of the United States government. He never went home. Understanding what happened to the Apache requires understanding how the story got told. The primary sources for Apache history, the documents that historians used for generations, were produced by people with interests in a specific version of events. US Army officers writing reports that justified their operations and their budgets. Territorial newspapers funded by land and mining interests that needed Apache removal to proceed. Federal policy documents produced by an administration committed to a specific outcome. Apache voices were not absent, but they were consistently filtered, translated, summarized, and recontextualized by people with reasons to distort them. Geronimo eventually dictated a memoir, Geronimo, His Own Story, published in 1906. It went through an editor and translator and was shaped by the constraints of what a prisoner of war could safely say. It is still one of the most valuable documents we have. Other Apache accounts exist. They have been collected by anthropologists, by historians, by Apache people themselves working to preserve their own history. They tell a consistently different story from the military records. Not a story without complexity. The Apache raided, they killed, they took captives. Their warfare was real, and it caused real suffering to settlers, to Mexican communities along the border, to other indigenous peoples with whom they had long-standing conflicts. The Apache were not saints. Nobody is asking for that framing. What is being asked for is an honest accounting that includes the full context, the Spanish slave raiding, the broken treaties, the Camp Grant Massacre, the imprisonment of an entire people, including their children, the denial of return to their homeland after surrender, an accounting where the violence runs in both directions on the ledger, because right now, in most standard historical treatments, it runs in only one. Here is something the history of the Apache Wars almost never includes. The Apache still exist. The Chiricahua, the people imprisoned, transported across the country, held as prisoners of war for 27 years, their children sent to boarding schools, survived. The White Mountain Apache tribe manages over 1.6 million acres in Arizona. The Mescalero Apache tribe governs significant land in New Mexico. The Fort Sill Apache tribe exists in Oklahoma, descended from the prisoners of war who were never returned to Arizona. Apache communities today are engaged in language preservation, working to document and teach the Apache language to younger generations, because the boarding school system came extraordinarily close to severing the intergenerational transmission of language entirely. They are engaged in legal processes around land rights and resource management, around the recognition of historical trauma and its contemporary effects, around the specific documented ways that federal Indian policy, not just in the 19th century but through much of the 20th, disrupted Apache community and family structures in ways that still have measurable effects on health outcomes, economic outcomes, educational outcomes. This is not ancient history requiring excavation. It is recent enough that its consequences are present and measurable right now. The distorted version of Apache history, the one that centers American expansion as inevitable and just, that frames Apache resistance as savagery, that ends the story neatly in 1886, persists for reasons that are not difficult to identify. It is easier. It does not require sitting with the discomfort of what was actually done. It does not raise questions about the legitimacy of land transfers that form the basis of current property arrangements across the American Southwest. It does not require acknowledging that the United States government held an entire people, including loyal scouts, including children, as prisoners of war for nearly 3 decades. The comfortable version requires less of the audience, and it requires less of the institutions, educational, governmental, cultural, that have a stake in a particular national narrative. But the uncomfortable version is the accurate one. And accuracy in this case is not just an academic preference, it matters to living people. To Apache communities working to preserve language and culture against the documented, deliberate efforts of federal policy to destroy both. To Apache people navigating a legal and political landscape still shaped by 19th century decisions made about them without their participation. To anyone trying to understand how the American Southwest actually became what it is. Ending, not elegiac, direct. Geronimo died a prisoner. His people's children were taken and forbidden from speaking their own language. The land was taken, and the people who fought for it were imprisoned and transported 2,000 miles away and held for 27 years and denied permission to go home. And then the US Army named a helicopter after them. And most people learned a version of this history in which the Apache are a chapter that closes in 1886 with a surrender that confirmed the rightness of the outcome. That version of history is doing something specific. It is making a series of choices about what to include and what to leave out, and those choices consistently favor the people who won and consistently erase the experience of the people who lost. The Apache did not disappear in 1886. They are here, and the history that was done to them, not just the warfare, but the imprisonment, the child removal, the language suppression, the land dispossession, is documented in federal archives, in military records, in congressional reports, in the words of Apache people who lived through it and chose to speak. The information exists. The question is whether we are willing to look at it directly, without the comfortable distance of a story that was already decided before we got there. If this is the history you were never taught, subscribe. There is more of it, and it matters more than most people realize.